Okay, so we're on page 535 in the Red Chumashim, chapter 32, verse 25. And page 174 in the Friedman, for those who want to follow along. I'm also going to pass this out. This is going to supplement the reading from Friedman.
$134 in the Friedman.
Yep.
174.
174, yes.
I don't think.
Okay, so what we looked at last time is Moses was on the mountain. Moses was receiving the Ten Commandments, specifically the tablets, to bring down to the people. And meanwhile, back at the base, at the ranch, all of the people kind of attack Aaron and say, we don't know where God is, make us a god, if you will. So Aaron collects all of the silver and the gold and the jewelry. He has, the men in particular, collect it from the women. And they throw it into a fire, and out comes this golden calf. And there's this idea that that in doing this, Aaron basically says, let's do this, we'll create it, and then tomorrow we can worship Adonai, in particular that name of God. And then Moses and God have this whole interaction, this exchange, whereby they realize what's going on. God gets really angry, Moses calms him down, and then Moses gets really angry, comes down the mountain, throws the tablets, breaks them into pieces, and they destroy the golden calf, and they do what with it?
Eat it.
They grind it up and they make him drink it.
Yeah.
It was one of the first protein shakes. Yeah? And then Moses says to Aaron, in this very kind of harsh way, in verse 21, what did this people do to you that you have brought such a great sin upon them? There's a direct blame, if you will, from Moses to Aaron. And he says, let not my Lord be enraged. You know that this people is bent on anger. Right? So Aaron then turns around and blames the people. They said to me, make us a god to lead us for that man Moses who brought us from the land of Egypt. We don't know where he is. So I said to them, whoever has gold, take it off. They gave it to me. I hurled it into the fire, and what happened? Poof! The first David Copperfield event. Right? Out comes a golden calf. I didn't do it. It wasn't my fault. It was magic. Okay? You can decide for yourself if you want to believe Aaron's side of the story, Moses' side of the story. By the way, we know both sides of the story because we saw what happened before Moses came back and then after. And then, in verse 25, I'm going to read this one in the Hebrew because the language is a very interesting pun. It says, Vayar Moshe et ha'am, Moses saw the nation, ki faruahu, they were out of control. Ki fira'o aharon l'shimsa b'kamehem, because since Aaron had let them get out of control. And if you look at that second word in the Hebrew, just below line 20, verse 25, it has exactly the same letters and almost the same vowel structure as what word? Pharaoh. And so the Torah is, in a way, suggesting that Moses is seeing Aaron functioning in a pharaonic-like manner. Which means he doesn't have control over the people, or he is playing God in a certain manner.
So this is actually a story that's always troubled me.
Me too.
Aaron obviously created a great sin here. I mean, he's trying to write himself off.
Yep.
But this is a huge sin. It seemed like everybody who sinned always gets punished.
Yes.
Why did he get rewarded and become the head of the priest?
And that's what we have to figure out.
Exactly.
That is a great question. And that's what we have to try to figure out. Go ahead.
Is it such a great reward to be a priest? I mean, you spend your whole life dedicated to, the priesthood. It's
So that's the ancient interpretation. The modern interpretation, right, you got to look at it through our eyes, is,
Right.
Hey, look at this. We have a person who's dedicated to the shul. Right. Right.
quick bar mitzvah them.
Right? So, but yes, you're asking exactly the right question. Why on earth, of all of the possible things that happen, and by the way, we're going to see in just a bit, there are people who get killed. But the people who get killed does not include Aaron, and it doesn't include the Levites. And it's important that we put the Levites in there because at this point we don't actually have a separation of power between the priests and the Levites according to the story. But you're 100% right. It doesn't make any sense. And we have to figure out why. And part of unpacking it is understanding who are the Levites, what is their role in writing this story, and what is the takeaway that they want us to have in terms of their role going forward. But yeah, you're right. It doesn't make any sense. He should have been the first one to get axed. Or at the very least, he should not have been the first priest. Don't get me wrong, he goes through plenty of service. Right? He has this life of servitude to God, and he loses his first two children in the act of their priesthood. Yeah.
So this is what we talked about last week, the idea of Aaron seeing how bad things are with the community, and if he tries to stop them rather than go along with them, things could be worse.
Yep.
And maybe that's why God saw that he was doing the best thing he could under the circumstances.
Right.
And that's why he gets removed.
Could very well be.
Except for this phrase that Moses says, since Aaron had let them get out of control.
Yep.
I never read that
Yeah.
before.
And on
That's
top of that, he lied to Moses.
a problem.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting question. And by the way, we've now seen three different ways of understanding the story. The first way is that they all go to Aaron, and Aaron says, bring me your gold, and we'll throw it in and we'll make a god. Which we could interpret as he's complicit, or he's trying to buy time, or he's not really sure what's going on, so, well, it's better to have them in contained chaos than in uncontrollable chaos. I'm not really sure how that works out, but okay. So, one second, Bob. So that's the first thing. Then we have the retelling of the story. In the retelling of the story, Aaron says, I had nothing to do with it. They brought me all their gold, they threw it in the fire, and poof, Lord of the Flies. That's part two.
So he lied to Moses.
Right? Then Moses says, no, Aaron, it's your fault. Okay? And then we're going to see this very interesting thing come in just a second. Go ahead.
It seems to me that, getting back to what you said about Aaron trying to contain the chaos, he's deflecting their concern and their near hysteria by letting them focus on the golden calf he's going to create.
Right.
This will, in fact, calm them down, even though they were celebrating afterward
Yep.
in a way that Moses found repulsive.
Right. Well, yeah, that's right. It's a new focal point, right? Pay attention to this for a moment rather than go off on your own tangent and get distracted away from it. By the way, the covenant is so new, right? This has only been a few weeks since they got the Torah, since they got the Aseret HaDibrot, the Decalogue, and the first thing that happens is Moses disappears. They've only just recently left Egypt. They only have just recently come to know this particular God. So they don't really understand yet what's happening. Was it Riku? You were saying something?
Yeah, I was looking at this, the two narratives of what Aaron, when we saw earlier before his encounter, in trying to find the particular verse. I didn't think the two were all that different. In both of them, he just put all the gold in the fire, and it came and a molten calf. How that appeared, whether he fashioned it or it happened like Lord of the Rings or whatever you want to call it, or
Lord of the Flies.
Lord of the Flies.
I mean, it could be Lord of the
Those
Rings.
are
I don't
all-
know.
I don't know how that works, but I'm not familiar with either of those.
Right.
So, but it happened. It just happened.
It did just happen. Okay, but look at verse
But
26.
it doesn't say that he fashioned it. Out came a
No,
molten-
no, that's true. He does not say fashion.
It out came a molten calf.
Correct. Well, I thought there was one.
I thought there
Did
was
it
a
say they put
molten.
it in a mold?
It doesn't say that. It doesn't say
Hold on a
that.
second.
I read it
Midrash.
last week.
Yeah, I'm talking about the last week ones.
They don't say anything about the
In verse 2, it says, Aaron said to them, take off the gold rings that are on your ears and your wives and your sons and your daughters and bring them to
They
me.
made it into a mold.
And all the people took it off,
Oh, cast a mold.
Cast
Right?
in a mold.
And cast in a
right?
mold.
This he took from them and
Oh, he
cast
did
in a
cast in a
mold
mold.
and made it into a molten calf.
So he made a mold.
He made it. Who
That's
made it?
right. So
Okay.
presumably the he here is Aaron.
Aaron. Yes.
And-
Took from them. Made
But they're the ones who respond, and they exclaimed, this is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. It's one of those weird things where we switch from singular to plural in the same sentence.
Yes.
The singular
They-
referring to Aaron, and the plural seemingly referring to the Israelites.
Israelites, the people.
That's
And then-
right.
And then Aaron built an altar.
That's right. And then when Aaron sees this, what does he do? Vayiven mizbeach lefanav. He builds a mizbeach, an altar before them. Vayikra Aharon, and Aaron speaks and says, Chag ladonai machar. Tomorrow will be a festival for Adonai. So we have two different competing notions of God in the same story. One of Elohim, right, an idol to Elohim, and then Aaron declaring, no, it's a festival to Adonai. But if you...
Unless it's Adonai Elohim.
Doesn't say it though. They say it in two separate cases. One is Elohim and one is Adonai. But go back to verse 26 because Moses' response to this whole thing is very perplexing. Verse 26 says, Moses stood up in the gate of the camp and said, whoever is for Adonai, come over here. Who goes? All of the Levites. Now, who wrote this story according to Friedman? No. It's Elohim. It's Elohim. It's very perplexing that the Levites are the ones who run forward as if they're the pious ones who are all siding with Adonai. And so what does he say to them? Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. Notice that we're talking about Israel here. Each of you put sword on thigh, go back and forth from gate to gate throughout the camp, and slay your brother, neighbor, and kin. So the Levites did as Moses had bidden, and some 3,000 people fell that day. Moses said, dedicate yourselves to the Lord this day, for each of you has been against son and brother, and he may bestow a blessing upon you today. So, here's the story. After all this back and forth, bantering with Aaron, Moses says, who's on the Lord's side? The Levites run over, and then what does he ask them to do? Kill. Before he asks them to kill.
Put on a sword.
Put a sword on their thigh, right? So saddle up, if you will, and then go out and kill a whole group of people. Who are these people?
He didn't specify who they
He
are.
doesn't specify who they are, at least not according to the text.
Presumably it's the ones who were not for the Lord.
That's right.
But it's
So
not
that would
random
be
killing.
all the others.
Right, so presumably either all the others, those who didn't come over, or those who were not for the Lord, not on their side, and were complicit in the building of the golden calf.
The other 11 tribes.
Or a group of 3,000 people that were comprised from those. What were you
Well,
going to say?
that's the confusing part of this. Did they kill everybody but the Levites?
Well, not they. Of course, they don't kill the Levites because the Levites are called out by name as being the ones who come forward.
So there are 2 million people.
No, 600,000.
600.
No, actually, the numbers are not right.
That's just
It
the
was
men.
600,000 men
Yeah.
over the age of 20. So of military status.
So about 2 million. maybe.
I mean, if you realistically think that we could move 2 million people out of Egypt, that alone would have taken 40 years. Okay, but let's hold the numbers for a moment because I don't know that the numbers are so accurate.
There would have been no one left in Egypt.
Huh?
There would have been no one left in Egypt.
Right.
Well, so in his most recent book, The Exodus, he claims that the Exodus was a purely Levitical Exodus.
Correct.
Does this not support that?
It does. How does it support it?
Because they kill everybody but the Levites.
So that's one
They
possibility.
elevate the Levites.
That's right. They elevate the Levites.
I mean,
But-
that's,
But if there's only 3,000, whom are they killing? How many are they killing?
Who cares?
First of all,
I mean, really, who cares? I mean,
who cares?
that's not, I think the numbers just kind of get us off the
Well, they
track
killed
of
a lot of
what-
people.
what's going on.
Right.
As
And
a-
by the way, who does the killing?
Yeah.
People do the killing, not God.
Right.
Right? Remember, Moses talks God down off the ledge. God is ready to annihilate them. And so what ends up happening is Moses tells the Levites to come. But now we have this very interesting separation that's happening in the story because in one story that is presumably authored by the E tradition, by the Elohist tradition, you have the Elohists and the Levites separating one from the other. The Elohim people represent the people connected to the golden calf, and the priests represent the people that are anti the golden calf, on the opposite side. So in one story, written by one particular author, hypothetically, you have a whole group of people that are separating themselves from the rest of the group, from the rest of the pack. What were you saying?
Could it be that they converted at that point to become from Elohist
Catholics?
to no, believing in Adonai at that point?
Right. Could be.
This was the first jihad.
sword or.
You're several hundred
sword
years
or-
early, my friend.
But, yeah, well, it predates, it presages.
Pre-jihad.
Right,
It presages.
right. Yeah, maybe. It's also interesting because why is it important that we know from this story that it is the Levites? Why is it important for us to know that the Levites are the people who all separate themselves to worship God?
Because they're the ones who will assume the responsibilities for the temple or the tent of meeting
Yep,
as a tribe.
yep.
And they will not have a portion, no land.
They don't know that yet.
Right, but this is going to be, they're already separating.
Yep, that's one reason, but there's another one, I think.
They're the only ones jealous for Yahweh.
Why? Who are they trying to support?
Their kinsmen.
Who are their kinsmen?
Moses.
That's it, Moses and Aaron. Right? If they don't separate themselves, then they're not supporting the leaders of the people, namely Moses and Aaron, who are Levites. Forget priests for the moment. We don't know what priests are yet, right? At least not in the Jewish context. It hasn't happened in the Torah yet. But in this way, and this may be a piece of the answer to your question, Jerry, the Levites have to stick up for each other.
It's tribalism.
It is tribalism in its most authentic form. And so the Levites here are trying to come to the rescue of Moses and Aaron.
So Moses really is becoming more the leader of the Levites than he is of all the people.
Yeah.
It's getting back to his tribe.
Right? And it may actually support other things we've read up until now in in Exodus, whereby the Torah tells us more than once that it is the Levites, right? We first have it in chapter 2 of Exodus, and then we have it again in chapter 6. It is the Levites who are the ones who are responsible for putting the Exodus in motion. The Levites, if you will, are coming to the rescue, not only of Moses, but of also Aaron. Aaron could not have actually done what says he did, because he is a person who says, tomorrow we're going to celebrate Adonai. So just because maybe he didn't get it right, he at least knew who the right God was. It's a little bit more complex than that, but yeah.
So this is kind of a parallel story because it's the exact same thing that happened to Akhenaten.
Yep.
So is that okay
Tell
to...
them who Akhenaten is.
So Akhenaten was, he was the pharaoh of all of Egypt, and he did away with the polytheistic religious structure and went back to the old kind of Egyptian religion, the god of the Aten, which is the sun, the sun god, and set up a whole new city called Amarna. Egypt was elevated to a higher level of productivity and culture and art. And then upon his death, the Egyptians wouldn't accept a monotheism, or a monolatry is what it really was. So his son utterly destroyed Amarna, ripped it out by the roots. The way they would do that in Egypt is they'd rip the faces off, and any depiction or imagery, any image of God in the Jewish context. And that Akhenaten was contemporary with Moses. So maybe Aaron was a priest. Maybe there were priests and they were the ones that were fleeing. And there was a relationship between the Hyksos, who were also monolithic.
Yeah, we'll have to dig a little bit more into the history so that we can put those pieces together for people. Bob, will you read starting verse 30 through 35, the end of the chapter? Because there's one other key line at the end of the chapter that I want to make sure to highlight.
The next day Moses said to the people, "You have been guilty of a great sin. Yet I will now go up to the Lord. Perhaps I may win forgiveness for your sin." Moses went back to the Lord and said, "Alas, this people is guilty of a great sin in making for themselves a god of gold. Now, if you will forgive their sin, well and good. But if not, erase me from the record which you have written." But the Lord said to Moses, "He who has sinned against me, him only will I erase from my record. Go now, leave the people where I told you. See, my angel shall go before you. But when I make an accounting, I will bring them to account for their sins." Then the Lord sent a plague upon the people for what they did with the calf that Aaron made. Continue?
Nope, good for now. So, what's the end of the chapter? Another plague. We don't know if anyone dies yet, but there's two other really important pieces that happen.
Again, it's going back to the fact that Aaron made the god.
Good. So there's another reference here of Aaron's role in the story, and it blatantly calls it out.
Right. Real clear.
Very clearly, right? Al asher asu et ha'egel asher asa Aaron. That Aaron is the one who is making it, right? He's involved in this process.
Aaron may make it, but what they did with it is the important part.
Well, it's,
Were they treated as God or did they treat it as a toy? That's so if anybody did not believe it and kept it only as a battle, they're okay. But if you start believing that is the God, then
correct. So the trick with this verse 35 is the Hebrew. Vayigof Adonai ta'am. So God causes a magifai, a plague, on the people. Why? Al asher asu et ha'egel asher asa Aaron. Because of what they did with the calf that Aaron had made. Meaning if Aaron had made it and they didn't do anything with it, there would have been no problem. He might have gotten a little slap on the wrist because he shouldn't have made it. But in this case, what is the text doing for Aaron?
It's taking away his guilt. It's
That's
not what
right.
he
On
did.
the one hand, you could read it as him being involved in it. On the other, you could read it as absolving him of it. Meaning, he's not necessarily as bad off as you might have thought him to be. Right?
Because he wasn't worshiping the calf.
So the text, in a way, is putting a bias into the story in terms of being able to absolve Aaron of his role. Julie?
So in 33, it says, he who has sinned against me, him only.
yeah.
Is that
Yep.
the singular, right?
Vayomer
only
lo
I
mi
will-
asher chatali. Yes.
Okay, and then, but then at the end of that paragraph, but when I make an accounting, I will bring them to account for their sins. So
There's a...
yeah, it's not,
It's not parallel.
Yeah, it's not parallel.
Correct.
Well,
So can you read the whoever,
yeah, can you read?
He, whoever, right,
Each of
because
them,
multiple people.
each one
each one?
who has sinned.
Right.
Since that's singular, I will
Yep.
erase
I will.
him from the record.
Yes, mi asher chatali. Anyone who has sinned
Okay.
is another way to read it. Emechenu, I will erase from my book, for my covenant, if you will.
It's just interesting that, you know, he changes from the singular to the
Correct.
plural.
We got
Here's
it?
another
Oh,
question that's always puzzled me too. They bring all their gold and jewelry to make into this calf.
Yep.
They were slaves. Where'd they get gold
They
and
took
jewelry?
it from the people before they left.
It's
So
in
there
the-
are several midrashim that try to explain it. One midrash is that it was actually them taking back what was theirs, meaning when they went into Egypt initially, they had amassed significant wealth. Remember, they were living under the time when Joseph was essentially Pharaoh's number 2. And once it's revealed that Joseph is who he is, he welcomes his father and his brothers back to Egypt, and Pharaoh gives them all kinds of wealth.
Yeah.
So some suggest that the wealth that they had was taken from them when they became enslaved. Others suggest that during the plague of darkness, the Israelites were able to see, but the Egyptians could not see. And so what they did was they went in and they looted all of the stuff that belonged to the Egyptians and took it with them as they were leaving as reparations for their servitude.
That's why they didn't have time to make bread.
They were running out of the gold.
They figured it was just
They robbed them while they were leaving.
I got 18 minutes.
Bread?
Bread or gold?
Right.
Yeah, really.
And they're already used to eating gold, so.
That's right.
Not yet.
Not yet, not yet.
But there's the
They can buy a whole lot of bread
What's
with
the
that
third?
gold.
The third is that the Egyptians said, get out of here, stop killing our kids. Here, take
Take your
this.
stuff, right.
Yeah.
It was given to them.
One of the reasons why, if we were to retell this story today, they would have actually not had to do any of it because they would have just wired the money through PayPal, and it would not have been an issue.
So can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
I think whether, you know, trying to explain the acts that happen, we're looking at the psychoanalysis of why this is happened and that happened. But the real issue to me is, if the priests had an opportunity to redact the Bible, why did they leave any of this in?
Great question.
Yeah.
It's a great question. And I think we're going to see it in just a little bit. Right? Because, well, let's try to think about it for a moment. What happens as a direct result of the golden calf?
They're all out of gold.
Yes. And? What's the story that immediately follows the getting of the new tablets from Moses?
Isn't there a rebellion against Moses?
Not for a little bit.
Okay. But the people have to be punished. in some
That's
way.
true. There are people who are punished. But right after this Torah portion, the last two Torah portions of the book of Exodus focus on what?
The covenant?
The building of the Mishkan. So you can make an argument that what this story suggests is the people needed a way to better understand being in relationship with Adonai. The whole, either on the one hand, plague, splitting of the sea, revelation, magic show was not going to be sustainable long term, and believing in an invisible God was not going to be sustainable long term. So they needed to come up with some strategy in order to be able to give them a way to stay connected to God. So what do? They build up Mishkan, a portable sanctuary. And what happens in the portable sanctuary?
God dwells there.
God dwells there. So God now dwells wherever they go. And what do as a way of communing with God? They offer sacrifices. Sacrifices is something that's familiar to them. They're bringing something tangible to a specific place in order to be able to offer to a God. But in this case, they can't see God. But what do they at least have?
The place where God
The
dwells.
place where God dwells, and individual people who can function on behalf of the people in relationship with God.
Because they don't even let them into the place where God
That's right.
dwells.
So it feels very special, very holy, very sacred. And so they come up with a response to try to mitigate something like this happening again. In a way, it's very crafty, but it also allows them to begin developing a relationship with God that is imageless.
In the Humash on 535 at the bottom, it says, just as the people of Torah are not to treat an idol as an embodiment of God, God has to learn not to expect the average person to comprehend the totally abstract, invisible deity.
Right. And by the way, what happens in the next story in chapter 33 and 34 is Moses has to go up and reconnect with God. God has to show Moses God's presence, right? That's the whole image of God sitting on a throne and not being able to see God's face, but seeing God's back. And then Moses comes down with the new tablets, and his face is radiant. It's one of my favorite Jewish stereotypes. In Hebrew, it says that Moses' face was karan or, right? It was illuminated with brightness, his skin was. But if you change the vowels from karan or to karen or, it means that his skin had horns in them, which is where that's where you get the horn. Okay? So, but he comes down and he reestablishes the covenant with the people. And now that the covenant has been established, what's the first thing that they do? They build a Mishkan. And if you look at Friedman for a second, and look what happens starting at the end of chapter 34. Through 35, 36, through the end of the book. Who is writing? The priests are writing. The priests retake control of the narrative as a way of reorienting us away from the idolatry and now focusing us on a new way of worshiping God. It's a complete shift in thinking and in practice and in theology and everything. So the priests come to the rescue, if you will. And may be the reason why we had to leave Aaron in the story. Aaron becomes this multifaceted character who on the one hand helps lead the people out of Egypt. He plays a role with Moses in speaking directly to Pharaoh. And then he becomes the pivot, if you will, between the people's worship of idols and a new system of worship that will allow them to connect with God. And by the way, he's punished. What's Aaron's punishment?
Loses 2 sons.
He loses 2 sons. He doesn't make it in the land. And anyone else as a result who is involved in the golden calf also does not make it in the land. But he becomes this person who really embodies the switch in practice from polytheism to either monotheism or monolatry, depending on which one we're going to talk about. Thanks, Ernie. Okay, I want to look at chapter 34. Chapter 33 is interesting, but I want to look specifically at chapter 34 because it's key and it's going to have some of the very important liturgy that we have in it, and it's the reconstituting of a relationship with Adonai, with J, that will pave the way for the priests to come into power. Okay? Would someone like to read starting with chapter 34? Bob, you're welcome to keep reading.
All right.
I'm on page 540 in the Red Chumashim, or 177 in the Friedman.
The Lord said to Moses, carve 2 tablets of stone like the first, and I will inscribe upon the tablets the words that were on the first tablets, which you shattered. Be ready by morning, and in the morning come up to Mount Sinai, and present yourself there to me at the top of the mountain. No one else shall come up with you, and no one else shall be seen anywhere on the mountain. Neither shall the flocks and the herds graze at the foot of this mountain. So Moses carved 2 tablets of stone, like the first. And early in the morning he went up on Mount Sinai, as the Lord had commanded him, taking the 2 stone tablets with him. The Lord came down in a cloud. He stood with him there and proclaimed the name Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he does not remit all punishment, but visits the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children, upon the 3rd and 4th generations.
Okay, so let's stop here for a second. Everyone know that passage? When do we recite it? High holidays. What else? On festivals, right? Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, except on Shabbat, because it's a form of petition. So what's different about the tablets this time from the first time?
Moses carved them.
Correct. In the first tablets that Moses got, God does the carving, literally with the finger of God. But in this case, Moses does the carving.
But inscribing is still done by God.
It's not exactly clear.
He says to bring it up in his words.
Even right.
Well, so you have 2 different pieces, which are, let's see, the first one is that I will inscribe upon the tablets the words, but then you have Moses carving the 2 tablets like stone. And,
It just seems to refer to the shape.
well, it's not clear. There seems to be, maybe it's in a different spot, there seems to be some evidence that Moses has more of a hand in the carving and the fashioning of the second set of tablets than the first set. As if to suggest that we have to be a part of the writing of the tradition more than just God giving it to us. Okay, but what is going on here? What's with the invoking of these divine attributes?
Who's
Moses.
Who's saying it? That's a really good question. We'll come back to that in 1 second.
Well, Moses is transforming God in the image of Moses. Moses.
Say that one more time.
Moses is trying to make God this humanitarian. He's sort of buttering him up.
Oh, okay.
Making him more humanitarian,
More human-like. We call that anthropomorphization.
Yeah.
That's the fancy word for it, right? Making God in human-like qualities.
Yeah.
Right? The idea that God has a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, that when God gets upset, God flares God's nostrils, God sits on a throne. We humanize God in order to make our comprehension of God something that we can understand.
But it's in total conflict for what we just read about how God responded to the, again, it seems like whenever we read some things that before or after there's just contradictions in terms of either the personification, the story. Again, when you say God's compassion is slow to anger.
Yep.
Well, the slow to anger is a little hard to kind of comprehend immediately following what we just read.
Good. Although, we do understand that perhaps the anger, while we can't comprehend it immediately, is something we'll comprehend over multiple generations.
Right.
Right? Which I guess would be the modern way of saying God's still holding a grudge. Okay, let it go, okay? Bob?
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention. But it says specifically, the Lord passed before him, meaning Moses, and proclaimed, the Lord. God is talking about himself.
That's right. So it's actually not super clear in the text as to who's saying these words. Is it Moses saying them about God, or is it God speaking about God's self?
In the 3rd person.
In the 3rd person. So let's make an argument that it's Moses for a second. What does it say about Moses' understanding of God?
Moses is trying to transform God into a more humanistic God.
Good. Which means that we also need to be like God and be forgiving and compassionate and whatever, or that God needs to be more like us.
More tolerant.
Huh? More tolerant. And if it's God speaking about God's self, what does it say about God?
God is.
He's being-
I am.
God is tolerant, God is compassionate. You may not necessarily see me that way, but that's my true nature.
But there's an irony in the last line of this
Yes.
quotation, right?
Exactly.
And we're trying to make sense of all this, you know? How can you at one point in a short paragraph emphasize his kindness and effort to forgive with this line, which I'm sure we can explain it by saying, oh, well, that only means if the children follow in the ways of their fathers, then they'll be punished. But why do we have to explain it? Why is it there?
But,
Rabbi?
because it seems to
Yep.
contradict.
I think I contributed to this, because think of when the Bible was written down. After the destruction of the first temple, after all the travails, the Israelites were trying to find a reason for their misfortune. And I guess this was a simple way of explaining it, because our ancestors had sinned.
Yes. Yes. By the way, that's exactly what Moses says to them in Deuteronomy. Right before they go in, he says, remember all of the things that your ancestors did, because you're going to pay for it, essentially. Don't screw it up again, because then your descendants are going to fall into the same trap. But yes, it's one of those things that we feel like the third and the fourth generations continue to, unfortunately, take on all of the punishment from the mistakes of our forefathers, if you will.
Inherited guilt.
By the way, I don't know that it's so different from what we experience in modern society.
No.
Right? We are often fixing the problems that were created for us by people who came before us. And in the process, we're making new problems for our next generation to deal with. Right?
But isn't it the fact that they became problems later? Not that you're fixing problems, but you're fixing problems that evolved during time. Things were not problems when they were created.
Sometimes I think that's true. Sometimes we do things that we didn't anticipate or think were problems, but
Unintended
consequences for sure. Yeah.
So it's here it says, God's compassionate and gracious, slow to anger.
Yep.
Well, in other stories we read, God's got a huge temper and needs to be talked down all the time by humans.
And we just saw that, right? Isn't that exactly what Moses does? And what's really interesting about this text, aside from the fact that it's of a different author, it's almost like God is taking into account his earlier exchange. Moses says, whoa, hold on, God. Take a deep breath. Calm down. Do one of those things they do in California where they meditate and breathe. And now God's saying, no, look at me. I am a compassionate, gracious, slow to anger kind of God. But just for good measure, I still take out punishment on the next series of generations. Unless, what happens? Unless we change. Unless we do something different.
I mean, slow to anger is taking so many generations to get angry about it.
Right, and God is so pissed right now, God is giving us a perpetual silent treatment, right? But that's, but God is working on that in therapy. Okay, and if you, was there another comment?
Well, he's saying that it may happen or may not happen.
Right.
I was just going to say, the phrase that comes to mind for me is, do as I say, not as I do.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Exactly.
All right, Bob, will you read a little bit more, starting verse 8? 542.
Moses hastened to bow low to the ground in homage and said, if I have gained your favor, O Lord, pray, let the Lord go in our midst. Even though this is a stiff-necked people, pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for your own.
Thank you, Glenn.
He said, I hereby make a covenant. Before all your people I will work such wonders as have not been wrought on all the earth, or in any nation. And all the people who are with you shall see how awesome are the Lord's deeds which I will perform to you. Mark well what I command you this day. I will drive out before you the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Beware of making a covenant with the inhabitants of the land against which you are advancing, lest they be a snare in your midst. No, you must tear down their altars, smash their pillars, and cut down their sacred posts. For you must not worship any other god, because the Lord, whose name is impassioned, is an impassioned God. You must not make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, for they will lust after their gods and sacrifice to their gods, and invite you, and you will eat of their sacrifices. And when you take wives from among their daughters for your sons, their daughters will lust after their gods, and will cause your sons to lust after their gods. You shall not make molten gods for yourselves.
Okay, so I want to recap something with you. Chapter 32, that's when we get the first set of tablets. Who is the author of the first tablet story? Elohim. Okay? Those tablets are destroyed, and in the midst of it we have the golden calf. Okay? The second tablets, chapter 34. Who is the author of this story? J, at the very least it's J, we start to have ripples of the priests, okay? And what happens when J authors the story? What's the end result of the new tablets? There is a new covenant. Politically speaking, what is going on here? A new nation is being formed.
Contract.
A new contract is being formed. But there's something even more profound happening.
Between
Between the two narratives.
Well, the two narratives reflect the two states.
So in a way, there's the political divide of the North and the South. And?
God is explaining that you're going into a land full of pagans.
Yep.
You must not practice their ways. Don't even take their daughters for your sons.
That's great.
Wives.
And?
Keep the bloodline pure.
Good.
Erase that.
Yeah, he's out.
Erase the elephants.
E is out. This establishes a new way of connecting with one God, namely J. Right? We have two tablet stories. The first tablet story is linked to the golden calf, which is linked to idolatry, which is linked to Egypt, which is linked to paganism, which is linked to everything that they're trying to get away from. We destroy it. Why do we build the golden calf? As a way of marking the end of this form of connection to God. Why do we recarve the tablets? As a way of reestablishing a breach with God that we thought might have been lost. Who now needs to carry the covenant forward? The priests. Who becomes the connector between this tradition and this tradition? Aaron. And that may be the reason why we need him in the story. Politically speaking, if we go with the northern southern, what were you going to say, Phil?
Okay.
If you were going to go with the northern-southern divide, right? Think about the northern part of Israel, the 10 lost tribes, and the southern part. Why do we need to reject the notion of the way Judaism is practiced in the north versus the south? What's happening politically? What is David doing?
Consolidating power in Jerusalem.
Yep. And which will yield what? Centralization of the faith. Right? In Judah. And by the way, in the tribe of Judah, or Judea, we have...
I don't know.
This is about trying to make Judah, or Adonai, supreme compared to the other understandings of God. And now who's going to carry it on? The priests. Which is why the end of chapter 34 is going to make that switch into the covenantal piece, into the priestly piece of authorship. If you will, what the authors did, very creatively I think, is they wove together all of the traditions into one to make sure that when we end the day, El is no longer God, but instead Adonai is. And that may be the purpose of the golden calf narrative.
To kill them, to destroy that.
Yeah, and look at the way that this narrative ends. I don't think that it's at all, I think it's intentional that the end of what we just read, that Bob just read, was all about a new covenant, and in particular, what happens when you make a new covenant? You no longer do what?
Follow the oath.
That's right. Which means that you no longer worship molten gods for
New rules,
yourselves.
New rules.
There are new rules in place.
And look at verse
Kind of
number
like
9.
Lucky Duck.
Verse
Number
9.
Verse 9 says, "If I've gained your favor, O Lord, pray let Yahweh go in our midst." Even though this is a stiff-necked people,
Yep.
meaning even though they followed Elohim, and they still made the calf, and they still want to follow Elohim.
And by the way, that verse right there, "V'salachta la'avoneinu la'chatatenu u'nechaltanu," is literally lifted out of the Torah here and thrown into Yom Kippur liturgy.
Exactly, this is so much of Yom Kippur stuff.
That's exactly right. Because what is Yom Kippur all about?
Atonement, you know.
It's about, but in particular, what kinds of atonement?
Sins
Sins
against
against
God.
God.
Us and God.
Us and God.
And in particular, the gods that we worship that we shouldn't worship.
Right.
And I'm not just talking about a deity. You can pick any number of things that we worship that we shouldn't worship. Technology, politicians, greed, you name it. You can put whatever you want in there. Okay? This is the ultimate purpose of the shift, is to move us away from the idolatrous behavior that always gets us in trouble. If we were to fast forward for a moment from the Torah into biblical history, what is the reason given for why the northern kingdom falls and the first temple is destroyed?
They had multiple altars.
Because of idolatry. Right? In which case, the golden calf actually is not just about some story that happens in the ancient world when we leave Egypt, but it was something that was happening perpetually throughout the history of the northern kingdom and the eventual fall of the southern kingdom. It epitomizes, if you will, our straying from God. And anytime we stray from God and lose focus in terms of our behavior and practice, bad things happen. Don't get me wrong, bad things happen even when we don't stray, but it's just worth putting it out there from a political standpoint. Someone had a hand up. No?
I was just saying, it seemed kind of similar to the Akedah, where you end one tradition of child sacrifice and go to the creed of circumcision.
Correct. Yeah, exactly right. And by the way, we see that as a J tradition, right? That whole part of the story is the shift. In the Binding of Isaac, we actually have two authors in one story. We have E at the beginning and J at the end. It's almost an identical. That's a great connection.
It's just so interesting that, probably the story about the golden calf was around a long time, even, and then to take it in for another purpose, it's really, it gives a whole new, the way it's been put together in this way is the way you're doing it, to me, is just making this more fascinating in terms of, yes, it's the political stuff, but the way it was put together to get to the end of Adonai is
Right.
just fascinating, the way...
And I wanted to highlight it because it goes back to Linda's and Jerry's question. Why do we need the story? Why is the story here? Why do we let Aaron off the hook in a way? Why did the Levites emerge as these great leaders who are going to all of a sudden, take it? Why is it that the historians say that if anyone left Egypt, it was actually the Levites? Because the Levites were the ones who were willing to abandon El traditions and move to an Adonai tradition, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh tradition. So, yeah.
My eye just happened to fall on the line 28, this is where it says Moses wrote so although earlier we said it was not Moses writing, it wasn't clear, or it was suggested that God himself inscribed the letters, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant and the Ten Commandments.
Oh, so that's priest. Oh, yeah, and actually that makes sense because it's priestly. The little part that intervenes from where Bob ended through the end of 27 is really the finishing of the J tradition. It is a reminder, interestingly enough, of Passover.
Yeah.
In particular, the need to do this in the springtime. There is a reminder in verse 19 of the firsts, the first issue of the womb. If you've ever heard of a Pijon Haben,
Yeah.
right? The redemption of the firstborn.
Right.
That's where, did you redeem him? You were redeemed? Me too, I was also redeemed. All right, but not just
That's
of the
hearsay.
firstborn, but of also the firstborn animal.
Yeah.
And if you're not redeemed, what happens to you?
None should.
You have to commit to a life of service to the priests. All right, and then if you keep going, it talks about each of the different festivals with a little, thing, a little nod at kashrut to boot. But if you look at verse 27, it says, "And the Lord said to Moses, write down these commandments, for in accordance with these commandments I make a covenant with you and Israel. And it was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He ate no bread, drank no water. He wrote down on tablets the terms of the covenant, the 10 Commandments." So this is the moment where Moses is writing it all down. And from verse 29 on, basically through the end of Exodus, we enter the priestly tradition. So the golden calf narrative is important, not just because of what it teaches us about forgiveness, not just what it teaches us about a new covenant, but about what it does in terms of shifting our thinking about our relationship to God. And then, once we have a clear sense of who is God, the priests take over and create a whole new way of relating to God. Okay, any questions, comments, thoughts, reflections? Have I totally confused you?
These are not the Ten Commandments as we know them here, though. Well, I'm misunderstanding. This is the redaction of the Ten Commandments?
It's not clear exactly what it is. If you look actually at Friedman's note in his book, he says, I'm on 179.
Bottom.
It says this part is the J text of the Ten Commandments. This is made absolutely explicit in verses 27-28. Write these words for yourself because I made a covenant with you and in Israel based on these words. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the Ten Commandments. The first two commandments and the Sabbath commandment have parallels in other versions of the Ten Commandments, both in Exodus and in Deuteronomy, though the wording is different. The other seven commandments here are completely different. So presumably there is a reworking of the text. And many people argue that some of the Ten Commandments were actually already in existence. From where? No, I mean, kind of, there's origins in there, but from the Noahide laws. What makes the Noahide laws different from the 7 Noahide laws different from the 10 Commandments or the 10 utterances is that there are specific things that are for Israelites, namely Shabbat and the worship of Adonai, but many of them are actual parallels, one from the other. And so what people who were of a different faith had to worship or had to do with regard to God were, for the most part, the same as what the Israelites had to do. But if we really wanted to do a comparative study of the 10 Commandments, we need to look at Exodus, we need to look at Deuteronomy, and we need to look at a few different other excerpts in order to be able to piece it all together. But what we think of when we read it is Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5.
So I have the part of this that confuses me is
only one.
Well, the essence of it. So, like when you look at Moses' first meeting Hashem, which is Exodus 3:6, he says, "The God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob," and Moses hid his face. And then they don't say that Elohim is Yahweh. You have to get into
chapter 6.
Leviticus, I thought, does that. Is that chapter 6?
Chapter 6.
So
it's the very opening verses of chapter 6. It's where we know that that the ancestors knew God by multiple names, but God is revealing God's self to Moses by his real name.
So that's the key to the whole thing. I think everything else we've been talking about is well and good, but the part that really attracts me to it is Elohim and Yahweh, are they different gods? Is it the same God, but the God decided that the practice should change? And why does the name Elohim continue to survive the golden calf?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, not such a hard one to answer.
I don't have an answer to any of them.
Yeah. What we're going to do starting next week is we're going to start looking at the priestly function. So Linda is offered graciously to bring in an animal.
Hopefully not anybody's pet.
We're going to look at some of it, and I want to look specifically at the story that happens with Nadav and Abihu and Aaron's sons, and what goes wrong, really wrong, in the functioning of the priests. And then we're going to just spend a little bit of time on that connected to the politics of the northern and southern kingdom, and then we're going to switch into the H tradition, the holiness code, And then we're probably going to take a break for 2 weeks because some of us are going to be away, and then we will come back and continue for the end of May. I'll just, a little